Backstage at the Las Vegas Hilton in 1974, Elvis Presley was heading to the stage when he froze. His driver, James McClain, sat hidden in the corner, quietly crying. Most stars would walk past. Elvis didn't. What happened next not only saved a man's dignity, but reshaped his entire future. Las Vegas Hilton, November 1974. Nearly 20,000 people filled the grand showroom, their voices blending into a restless storm. The chandeliers shimmered, the velvet curtains glowed under stage lights, and cigarette smoke curled upward like ghosts above the crowd. Every chair was filled. Ushers whispered of another record-breaking night. Behind the curtain, Elvis Presley stood in his white bejeweled jumpsuit. The belt shimmered with rhinestones. He tapped the microphone once, listening to the sharp echo bounce back at him. The crowd outside began stomping their feet. "Elvis! Elvis!" The chant rattled the walls. On nights like this, the Hilton became its own universe. The carpeted hallways hummed with gamblers' laughter, the clinking of cocktail glasses, and the faint buzz of neon signs outside on Paradise Road. But here, in the showroom, all eyes were fixed on a single man, the king. The band tuned quietly in the pit, each chord drowned by the audience's roar. Security lined the backstage ramp, keeping order, making sure the star had a clear path to the stage. Everything was precise, timed, rehearsed. For Elvis, stepping on stage meant stepping into legend. Yet, that night, something unexpected cracked the rhythm, something raw, something human. Just past the loading ramp, where shadows drowned the light, a figure sat hunched on a folding chair. His shoulders trembled, his hands covered his face. James McClain, the man who had driven Elvis through deserts and highways, through midnight arrivals and sunrise departures. Elvis's driver. A man almost invisible to the world beyond the wheel. But on this night, James wasn't invisible. His silence screamed louder than the crowd. Elvis paused mid-step. The gold chain around his neck caught the dim backstage bulb as he tilted his head, watching. Managers waved at him urgently. "You're on, E." The countdown to curtain had already begun. The fans were seconds away from exploding. Still, Elvis's eyes didn't leave James. The crowd outside swelled again, shaking the air with chants. The Hilton staff darted nervously, whispering about timing, about pressure, about the need to move. But Elvis remained frozen, staring at his driver. What would you have done? Would you walk on stage, drown out the noise of one man's sorrow with the roar of 20,000? Or would you stop, risking everything, just to ask why a single man's world had cracked? The band began the opening riff without him, unsure if the star would appear. The stagehands panicked. The air felt like it was holding its breath. Elvis took one slow step toward the shadows, then another. And suddenly, the Hilton's brightest light was walking straight into the dark corner where his driver sat crying. The night was about to change. James McClain sat slumped on that cold chair, hidden from the glow of the stage. His uniform jacket was wrinkled, the driver's cap resting on his knee. He had been with Elvis for years, through long desert drives, endless tours, and the lonely miles between cities. He was steady, reliable, always quiet. But tonight, something inside him had collapsed. His hands pressed against his face. His eyes were bloodshot, swollen from holding back tears too long. The sound of the crowd outside seemed far away, muffled, like thunder heard from underwater. He thought no one would notice. For men like James, invisibility was part of the job. He drove the cars, carried the bags, opened the doors. He made sure Elvis never had to worry about the road ahead. And when his own life cracked, he hid it, because that's what people like him were expected to do. But grief is stubborn. It seeps through even the toughest walls. That night, James could not hold it in. His daughter was sick back home. Medical bills piled higher than his paycheck could cover. He hadn't told Elvis, hadn't told anyone. He feared that weakness meant losing his place, losing the little stability he had left. So he broke quietly, hoping the noise of 20,000 fans would drown his pain. Elvis saw through it instantly. The king stopped in his tracks, ignoring the frantic hand signals from stage managers. He could have pretended not to notice. That would have been easier. But Elvis's eyes locked on James's trembling shoulders, and something in him refused to move forward. He walked closer. The sequins of his jumpsuit shimmered under the dim bulb. But in that corner, the glitz faded. There, it was only one man standing before another. No stage, no spotlight. "James," Elvis said softly, barely above a whisper. James froze, embarrassed, wiping his face quickly with the sleeve of his jacket. "Sorry, Mr. Presley, I didn't mean—" "I'm fine, sir." His voice cracked on the word fine. But Elvis didn't buy it. He bent slightly, his voice low, almost fatherly. "Tell me, brother, what's wrong?" James shook his head, shaking harder now than before. His lips trembled. "It's nothing. The show. You've got to go." He couldn't bring himself to say it, couldn't let the weight spill out. The irony was brutal. He had spent years driving Elvis safely through storms, through endless highways protecting the king's time. Now, at the very moment the king needed him steady, James could barely hold himself upright. Elvis stayed still, patient. The roar of the audience grew louder, chanting his name like a drumbeat. But inside this shadowed corner, it felt like a completely different world. Two men, one broken, one watching. How often do we pass by the quiet ones, assuming they're strong, assuming they don't need help? How many times do we let their silence convince us they're okay, when the truth is anything but? Elvis lowered himself onto the chair beside James. Managers whispered furiously. Security glanced at their watches. The band played an intro again, covering the delay. The Hilton was restless, but Elvis didn't care. The greatest performer in the world, a man about to step into roaring applause, sat in the shadows with his driver, waiting for the truth to surface. And that truth was about to break free. The band struck the opening riff for the second time. Horns blared, drums cracked. The audience screamed as if the king would walk through the curtain any second, but he didn't. Elvis Presley, the man who never kept his fans waiting, stood in the shadows instead. He should have walked forward. Every instinct drilled into him by managers and promoters told him to step into the light. But Elvis's boots stayed planted. His gaze stayed fixed on James McLean, who sat crumbling in the chair. A security guard leaned in urgently. "Mr. Presley, you've got to go. They're expecting you." Another voice hissed, "We can't delay any longer." The Hilton's strict schedule left no room for hesitation. Each minute cost thousands. The hotel executives wanted perfection, not pauses, but Elvis didn't move. Instead, he bent lower, his hand brushing James's shoulder. "What's wrong, brother? Don't carry this alone." James tried to stand, tried to compose himself, but the weight of his secret pulled him back down. His words came out in fragments. "It's my little girl. She's sick. Doctors. Bills. I can't keep up." His voice broke into a whisper. "I don't know what to do." For a moment, Elvis said nothing. The roar of the crowd seeped through the walls like an ocean tide. 20,000 people were chanting his name. Yet here, in the narrow backstage corridor, silence pressed heavier than noise. Then Elvis did something no one expected. He turned away from the stage. Gasps rippled among staff. A stagehand nearly dropped his headset. Was Elvis Presley really about to abandon the show? He walked over to a small folding table, the kind littered with set lists and spare microphones. Reaching into his jumpsuit pocket, he pulled out a silk scarf, the same kind he tossed into crowds during encores. He returned to James, pressing it into his driver's hands. "Wipe your eyes," Elvis said. "You're family to me." James stared at him, stunned, unable to believe the king of rock and roll had stopped everything just for him. The crowd outside grew restless, clapping louder, demanding to see their idol. Hotel staff paced in near panic, whispering about refunds, about chaos. The entire night teetered on collapse, but Elvis leaned closer, his voice gentle. "The music can wait. You matter more." In that instant, the hierarchy of fame crumbled. There was no superstar and servant, only two men, one choosing compassion over applause. Most stars would have walked past. Elvis didn't. He chose to pause the empire for a single man's tears, and with that choice, the course of the night and James's life shifted forever. The air backstage grew heavier with each second. The audience outside thundered like a storm, stomping and clapping for the man who still hadn't appeared. The Hilton's managers whispered frantically, some even pacing with clipboards, checking their watches as if time itself was slipping through their fingers. Yet Elvis Presley knelt in the shadows with James McClain. James clutched the scarf Elvis had pressed into his hands. The fabric was soft, still carrying the faint scent of Elvis's cologne, but his grip trembled. He couldn't stop the truth from spilling out now. "My daughter. She's in the hospital," James said, voice breaking. "They say she might not make it unless I can keep paying, and I can't. I just can't anymore." Elvis's eyes softened. The king, who stood unshaken before screaming stadiums, now looked at James as if nothing else mattered. The noise of 20,000 people faded into a distant hum. Then Elvis made a decision. Short, sharp, final. He reached into his belt, pulling out the checkbook he carried for moments exactly like this. He scribbled a number, tore the page, and pressed it firmly into James's palm. "Take care of her," Elvis said. James froze. He looked at the paper, then at Elvis, as if this couldn't be real. I can't take this. I can't." "You will," Elvis answered. His tone left no room for refusal. The backstage staff stared in disbelief. A stagehand whispered, "Did he just—" Security exchanged glances, unsure whether to focus on the show or the private miracle unfolding before them. But Elvis wasn't done. He placed his hand on James's shoulder, firm and steady. "Go be with her. You'll still have a job when you get back. Full pay." No questions asked. James's breath caught. His shoulders shook harder, not from despair this time, but from relief. He buried his face in the scarf, sobbing openly now. Elvis stayed with him, unbothered by the chaos of managers circling, unbothered by the impatient crowd demanding his name. The king of rock and roll had made his choice. Humanity before showtime. Outside, the band looped the intro for a third time, confused, stretching the riff while fans grew louder. But for Elvis, the world narrowed to one man and his pain. He whispered again, softer now, "Family first, always." And with those words, something inside James shifted. A driver who thought he was invisible had been seen. A man drowning in quiet despair had been pulled back to the surface. When he finally looked up, his face streaked with tears, James saw Elvis stand tall once more, ready to face the noise of 20,000. The king straightened his jumpsuit, adjusted the mic in his hand, and nodded to the nearest stagehand. It was time. The curtain rose. The crowd erupted in an explosion of sound. But no one in that audience knew that just minutes earlier, history had paused so a single man's life could change, and that hidden moment, known only to those backstage, would ripple far beyond that night. James McClain disappeared from the Hilton the very next morning. His shift was covered by another driver, and the staff whispered about why Elvis's most loyal man was suddenly absent. Few knew the truth. Fewer still would ever guess what had really happened in that dark backstage corner. At home, James was finally able to stay by his daughter's side. The check Elvis had pressed into his hand covered months of medical bills. Nurses remembered seeing him clutching that folded paper like a lifeline, and each time a doctor entered the room, James whispered silent prayers that Elvis's gift had bought him more time with her. Weeks passed. His daughter's health stabilized. For the first time in months, James could breathe again. He would tell friends later that it wasn't just the money that saved him. It was the moment of dignity. The fact that Elvis, of all people, had chosen to stop, to notice, to care. When James returned to work, he was different. His step was lighter. His shoulders no longer carried the same invisible weight. Staff noticed the way Elvis greeted him, not with formality, but with warmth, like a brother. From that day forward, James drove Elvis not just to concerts, but to doctors' visits, to late-night diner stops, even to quiet, aimless rides through Memphis where the king simply needed to think. The bond between them deepened, silent yet unshakable. James became more than a driver. He was trusted company, a reminder that even legends need family, and family isn't always blood. Have you ever had someone notice you when you thought you were invisible? That moment can change everything. For James, it meant stepping out of the shadows. No longer just the man behind the wheel, but the man Elvis relied on when the world grew heavy. And while the fans outside screamed for encores, while the headlines spoke of fame and glitter, James carried a quieter story, one that mattered even more. Years later, long after Elvis Presley's final encore, James McClain still told the story. Not to boast, not to elevate himself, but because people asked him what Elvis was really like when the cameras were off. And James would pause, his eyes softening, before repeating the words, "The music can wait. You matter more." He never forgot the silk scarf, still folded carefully in a drawer at home. He never forgot the check that had carried his family through the darkest storm. But above all, he never forgot the moment he realized the king of rock and roll had seen him, not as an employee, not as a servant, but as a man. The Hilton staff who had witnessed that night passed the story quietly among themselves. "Remember the time Elvis stopped the show?" one would whisper. They didn't talk about it publicly then. But backstage workers carried the memory like a secret legend, tucked between the noise of endless sold-out nights. Over time, the story spread. Fans repeated it on message boards, in late-night radio shows, in small-town Elvis clubs where diehards traded myths and memories. A bootleg tape of that Hilton concert still floats around, and if you listen closely, you can hear a strange delay before Elvis begins his first song. That pause, that silence, that was James's moment, and the legacy didn't end there. In James's hometown, a small plaque was placed years later in his honor. It carried just one line from his interviews: "Elvis saved my dignity." Letters began arriving at James's house from strangers. Some said the story changed how they treated their co-workers. Others admitted it made them stop for the crying neighbor they had ignored. One woman wrote, "Because of you and Elvis, I sat with my brother when he was breaking. He's alive today because I didn't walk past." That's how ripples work. One choice, in one moment, echoes far beyond what anyone expects. What would our world look like if more of us paused, like Elvis did, for the people hidden in the corners? For James, the answer was simple. He lived the rest of his life not as the driver, but as the man who carried a story of compassion wherever he went. Elvis Presley is remembered for his voice, his charisma, his dazzling shows. But the truest measure of a legend isn't found in the spotlight. It's found in the quiet corners where no cameras roll. That night in November 1974, at the Las Vegas Hilton, Elvis proved something rare. The king who could command the screams of 20,000 chose instead to hear the whisper of one man's tears. He chose to pause an empire, if only for a moment, to remind someone that his dignity mattered. For James McClain, that act rewrote the story of his life. For those who heard it later, it reshaped the way they saw fame, kindness, even their own neighbors. Elvis sang about love on stage, but backstage he lived it. And maybe that is the greatest legacy. Not the records sold, not the ovations, but the unseen choices that ripple for decades. The choice to stop, to listen, to care. If greatness is measured in compassion, then Elvis Presley was truly the king. Stories like this remind us that kindness can outlive fame. If this moment moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder of compassion today. Were you or someone you know ever touched by Elvis's music or generosity? Tell us below and watch the next story of his hidden legacy.